Hi everyone and welcome. So in this video I'm going to talk about the progression of learning, which is the second document. If you remember, we talked about in the first video the Programme de Formation d'Éducation de Québec, which focuses on the skills. So the progression of learning focuses on the content, and there are two documents here. So one for ESL, Cycle 1 and 2, and one for EESL. Okay, so progression of learning. There are two, as I said. So here's what the cover looks like for ESL and the one for enriched ESL. Now the content and the cover are exactly the same. So have a look at this. Different page numbers, obviously. So they talk about the progression of learning, the introduction, and there's 5 sections: culture, language repertoire, strategies, processes, and text. Sound familiar? If you remember, that is what the related content covers. So essentially the progression of learning just looks at the related content and tells you what you're supposed to cover and when you're supposed to cover it. Now throughout this video I'm going to use the ESL version of the progression of learning, but just keep in mind that the ESL document also exists and it follows exactly the same structure, just different content within it. So I encourage you to take a look at that one, if that's the ESL one, if that's the one you're teaching. Today we're going to go through the ESL. So yeah, related content. So that's what we're covering. Okay, so this is page 1. And the first thing we're covering is culture. Yay! So as we talked about in the first video, there's the aesthetic aspect of culture, the sociological, sociolinguistic. You can see here that essentially you're covering it all the way through. So different cultural products, different daily practices. It's kind of mushy and squishy. So we're supposed to be doing it essentially all the way through and have acquired it by secondary 4 or 5, so cycle 2. Okay, so culture, you're exploring, comparing, and using knowledge of cultural products from different language cultures, things like family relationships, pastimes, and communication conventions. So why would you say cheerio in England and g'day in Australia and hey in North America? Okay, so functional language is the next part. So language repertoire, we've talked about culture, now we're talking about language repertoire. Functional language, as we talked about in the last video for ESL, it's not as important to have those expressions as it is for ESL. So ESL, really, really important that you teach those key expressions like how are you, have to go now, sorry I didn't mean to, but you can see here in the ESL program, this is pretty much done. So you don't need to put that into your lesson plan. They should know how to do all this stuff already. Okay. What you do need, if you look here, so we don't need, they know how to ask for permission, they know how to interrupt a conversation, but we are starting to teach more advice and feedback, right? Because we're teaching them feedback in class. Sharing information. This is about exploring the texts. Why is this important? Why are the events and experiences happening? Asking people to support their opinions, so more critical thinking. Promoting cooperation, teamwork. Okay. The third page is, again, looking at the response process. So the literal meaning of texts, we'll get into that a little later, the response process. Underlying meaning of text, personal connections, and sharing generalizations. So the functional language here really is about digging into what you're reading, watching, listening. And again, writing production process, same thing. So when you're planning to write a text, what kind of things are useful to include in your text? If you're writing a persuasive essay, sometimes it's important to include a chart because it's a great way to show information. What do you notice? I notice the text has a table of contents or a large title, or it uses an image, or there's a caption. What kind of language is it using? So really getting into the features of a text and how to plan it, and revising and editing. You sure I don't know how to spell this word? Let's go look it up. I'm not sure. This paragraph is unclear. All of this. And finally, reflecting on their own development. So you can see how even just in the functional language, the ESL program is asking students to really do a different kind of task. Digging in. Yeah, literal meaning, personal connections. Here we go. Okay. Again, vocabulary is part of the language repertoire, but again, it's not very clear what vocabulary. There's no set list of vocabulary words. They should be based in the text that you are working with, and there tend to be more high-level words, so words that are used less frequently, but are sort of the more sophisticated language. So in ESL here, the program focuses on sharing information, promoting cooperation, and using the three processes. So the response process to respond to texts, moving from the literal meaning to making a personal connection to generalizing beyond, and the writing and production process, which talks about the features of a text, sharing ideas, planning and revising and editing, and reflecting on learning. Vocabulary, again, learned in context, but no specific list of words to learn and when, unlike in elementary. So strategies, we talked about that briefly in the first video. There's different categories of strategies. There's communication strategies, metacognitive strategies, cognitive strategies, and social affective ones. And have a look, you'll see some of the familiar ones. And gesture recasting, that's all done in elementary. What we are focusing more on is planning. Okay, seeking practice opportunities, self-evaluating, setting goals and objectives. Really being aware of yourself as a learner, what strategies work for you. Cognitive strategies, a lot of these we are reviewing. They have these, they're activate prior knowledge, delaying speaking. They should know how to do this, recombine. These are ones that are fairly familiar to them. You can teach them skimming and scanning and how and why that's important, but that's done by secondary one. Okay. An important one to teach is taking notes, using graphic organizers, guiding questions and prompts. They don't know how to take notes. Some of them have figured it out on their own, but most of them need to be taught. Transferring and using semantic mapping. So how to use graphic organizers, how to make mind maps. And again, managing an inventory. So social affective strategy, this we're still working on some of these. So how to ask for feedback and correction, especially when writing, how to develop cultural understanding, encouraging yourself and making positive statements to encourage others, and lowering anxiety, which is a really big deal these days. A lot of kids are anxious. A lot of adults are anxious. So strategies for the ESL program are different from ESL, just in that there are less focus on communication strategies. Makes sense, right? There's more focus on metacognitive, so things like planning, self-evaluating, setting goals, review on cognitive, but a lot more on social affective. Okay, I said we talk about the response process, and the progression of learning goes through those processes fairly well. So again, there are three processes. Response process, where you respond to text and explore them. The writing process, where you write texts. And production process, where you produce generally media texts, going beyond just actual words and into things like images and formatting. So the response process here, you can see exploring the text phase. You can see establishing a personal connection with the text. So you're answering, when you're exploring the text phase, you're using strategies, you're thinking about the overall message, sharing understanding with yourself, with others to adjust and deepen. Then you reach the personal connection, so you answer guiding questions. The teacher will ask things like, how would you feel if you were the main character? Or does this response make sense to you? Do you have anything in your life that relates to this? Blah, blah, blah. Generalizing beyond the text talks about, some of the themes and topics from the text and how that relates to things outside the book, maybe in your classroom or in your community or in the world. Issues like cyberbullying or election and how they're run, or social media's influence on critical thinking. Okay, so that's the response process. In the writing process, there are different phases too. So there's before engaging in the writing process. You deconstruct, you identify components of the written text. So if you're looking at an essay, How is that different from a magazine article? And deconstruct it together. So have a look and see what are some of the features that make a magazine article, and persuasive essay, a persuasive essay. And you have your phases here for the writing process. You're preparing to write, you're writing, revising, editing, and publishing. You can see that we're working on that, especially in cycle 1. But by cycle 2, this should be something that they're very used to. Okay. And finally, the production process. So the production process, again, are media texts rather than just your written text. So very important to identify text components in the models of media text written here, deconstruct them. You are then deciding how you're going to approach your film or your podcast or your magazine or your whatever it is. Selecting your appropriate audience, writing a focus sentence. You're producing, so this is kind of like the draft, and then post-production where you share your final version. Okay, so again, all 3 processes, the response you explore, you connect, you generalize beyond. In the writing process, we deconstruct. Sorry, the highlighting should come later. You prepare to write, you revise, you edit, and you publish. And production, you do pre-production where you deconstruct again, you produce, and then you share. And finally, once again, texts. So texts are all different kinds of things. They're not just reading stories, right? A variety of popular literature and information-based text. You can see that that happens all the way through. You're identifying text types and text forms. So you're working on that all the way to secondary 4. By the end of secondary 4, they should really recognize different text types. Looking at text components, language, register, and audience. That's a real focus in cycle 1. And text features. So when you're writing and producing your own text, you're able to use what you learned in cycle 1 and really apply it in cycle 2. Okay, so you explore a variety of authentic texts in the response process. Really important, you deconstruct the text. You look at the features, for example, things like headlines, shots, angles, color, composition, and then you use the information and features from the text in the writing and production processes. You can see how all these tie together. And that's it. Thank you for watching this video on